Hi, it's Rob MIlne of robmilne.com, and I welcome you to this presentation, which is very interesting. It's about some of the remnants you can see from the South African War, or Anglo-Boer War, from 1899 to 1902. I'm going to take you through these, and you're going to see a lot of these fortifications still in the veldt with me. Okay, during the South African War, there was a series of forts which were built. It started along the railway lines, which were the chief supply routes of the British Army into the interior of South Africa. And it started off with masonry or stone with mortar forts, which were designed by Major General Elliot Wood of the Sappers or Royal Engineers, and there were 441 built. Then it extended to a series of corrugated iron forts. There was eventually 6,883 of these forts which were erected, covering an area of 6,000 kilometers. But during the Anglo-Boer War, you'll come across, and the writing about the war, you'll come across a term called Sangar. Now, Sangar is a temporary fortified position, normally with a breastwork, which was originally constructed of stones. And here you can see some British troops in the veldt with some temporary structures in front of them to shield them from bullets. These are actually sand. This is in the Orange Free State. But as in India, in the late 1800s, they learned to build these forts out of stone. And here, if they'd done that at a place called Speerkop, and this was quite a defeat for the British Army on the 23rd of January 1900. This was during the attempt to relieve the siege of Ladysmith, where there was over 2,000 men killed on this battlefield. Now, the British had laid out trenches, it was laid out in heavy mist in the early morning by the sappers under Major Massey. And if they'd built Sangars or temporary stone structures, which would have provided head and shoulder cover, they would have done a lot better. But here was a tragic example of wrong fortifications at the incorrect place. And here, the Lancashire Fusiliers, there were more than 142 of them killed in these trenches where they were eventually buried. And you can see what the trenches looked like. Now, if they'd attempted rather to build breastworks or sangars rather than trenches, the result might have been quite different. So this is a contemporary photograph after the battle of the Lancashire Fusiliers, who were in fact buried where they fell in the trenches. And there we have the modern day memorial, and the stonework has been built up over the trenches where the Lancashires were buried. This is more conventional Sangar from the Anglo-Boer War. You can see it's a very nice protection. There's loopholes at the top, and the British, are well protected against the Boer riflemen. This is on the top of Nooitgedacht, a battle which took place in the Magaliesberg during the guerrilla phase on the 13th of December 1900. And here the British were a little bit lazy because they hadn't built their Sangars so effectively, as you can see, and the various Sangars didn't support each other. So whilst this looks like a very good protection, unfortunately this particular position was easily enfiladed by the Boers through dead ground and around the back. And this is a good example of a Boer Sangar at the Battle of Kalkjewel. And in the background you can see the road, the present day road. At that time the road next to the water was a little bit further across to the west. But this is a perfect Boer Sanger, providing a lot of protection. And here the Boers, only about 200 of them, ambushed a British column of cavalry of about 4,500 men, and quite effectively, and there was very little loss on the Boer side. Here's another Sanger, which was erected by the British in the Brulerstroom area, also near the battlefield of Kalkhevel. And this one is on Green Hill. Nooitgedacht battlefield is in the background. And this was a Sanger that was hastily erected by the British. You can see one of the loopholes that they used. And in the top, you can see the cover that still remains that would have protected their head and shoulders. And here, looking to the south, from also a similar Sanger on Green Hill, these were the hills that were occupied by the Boers and or the British, and should have been captured by General Smuts during the Battle of Nooitgedacht, but he arrived too late, and they were too well defended, and he could not capture them. So this is a classic British blockhouse. It's a 3-story blockhouse, and it's along the railway line in the Orange Free State. And you can see that there's a Mashuli gallery which is built onto it, which prevents the Boers from rushing the blockhouse and getting close to it and putting their rifles through the metal loopholes and causing chaos as they would have, let off their rifles. You can also see there's a retractable metal staircase which goes up to this particular blockhouse. And at the bottom of this gallery, there are shooting holes, which means that if the Boers managed to creep up to the sides of the blockhouse, they would be shot down by the British. Now, this one is near Modder River in the Orange Free State. This blockhouse was erected by the British near Jacobsdal on the 14th of February 1900, and there's no protection in case the Boers managed to rush up to the walls. So it wasn't a particularly good design. The other fault in the design is that you can see the water tower above the roof here could easily have been shot at and destroyed, and the British in this blockhouse, due to lack of water, wouldn't have lasted more than a couple of days. So again, not a very effective design. This blockhouse is called Fort Harlech, and it's in Monument Township, just outside Krugersdorp. And here the British got a bit wise, because when they erected this double-story blockhouse, afterwards they discovered that the Boers could creep up to the walls, again put their rifles through the loopholes, and cause chaos if they fired their rifles. So here they built 2 bastions onto the corners of the blockhouse so that they could enfilade across here any Boers who managed to try and creep up to the blockhouse. The reason this blockhouse survived for so long and in such good condition is that shortly after the South African War, it was recycled and used as a substation, or was a electricity power substation. And inside the blockhouse currently, and it's not used as a substation anymore, there's some very, very interesting switchgear and electrical equipment dating from just post-Anglo-Boer War. Here's a blockhouse, double-story blockhouse above the current Hartbeespoort Dam. This one was built above one of the necks or passes in the Magaliesberg. This one is above Commando Neck. And it's also quite curious because it must have been a very old-fashioned design, because you can see the battlements on the top here. It's more made for medieval archers than it is for modern-day riflemen. And this is actually a photograph of myself in about 1968, standing on the top, and my father yelling at me, saying, "Get off, boy, you're going to fall, you're going to fall." Anyway, so this is part of the reason for my interest in the Anglo-Boer War. My father always took me out into the veld exploring and looking at old blockhouses, and this was one of them. This one is quite interesting. It's also in Buddhistroom. It's known as the Orange Grove Blockhouse. The reason being it's not close to Orange Grove in Johannesburg, which we'll come to in a couple of photos' time. But this one is a double-story blockhouse, which is rather broken down now. And the reason it was called Orange Grove is that in this area in Buddhistroom, and it appears in the accounts of the Battle of Kalkhevel, there were a lot of orange groves in the area. And certainly after the Battle of Kalkhevel, the British soldiers availed themselves of all the ripe oranges that were in the orange groves after the battle on the 3rd of June 1900. So this one is a really unique blockhouse in that it's the only blockhouse ever built with its own fireplace. And here you can see in the slide the old fireplace that is still there and intact. Another interesting blockhouse in the Hekpoort area, and in the background you see the Magaliesberg. And here, where all the towers are, is the battlefield of Nooitgedacht. But as you come down through the Witwatersburg, through the pass, you will notice a blockhouse, and it's known as Barton's Folly. And why is it called Barton's Folly? Well, General Barton was in charge of the whole Krugersdorp district after Johannesburg had fallen between June 1900 and after, when the war ended in May 1902. And he built a blockhouse at the extreme northern point of his command at Hekpoort, and therefore it became known as Barton's Blockhouse. But then it became known as Barton's Folly because you can see there's high ground right next to it, and he built it totally in the wrong place. This is another view of Barton's Folly, Barton's Blockhouse, and there you can see it from the north looking south. Now the pass goes down this way, and you can see that the blockhouse could be enfiladed very easily at a distance of less than 500 meters from the east and from the west. So they found out that it was untenable to occupy this blockhouse. So although it was built at great cost by Royal Engineers, it could easily be enfiladed. And the other reason it was never occupied is there was no water supply nearby. So it was totally useless. So if ever you drive through down past the Brewhouse and Diner on your way down to Hekpoort and the Nooitgedacht battlefield, the Scarry Lodge, you will notice this blockhouse. So that's why it's called Barton's Folly. So the British had to roll out a lot of blockhouses. They had a lot of lines of supply to defend. They'd also worked out that one of the ways of rounding up the Boers was to build a line of blockhouses, and in between they would have barbed wire fences, and they would form large columns, and in line abreast they would march across the countryside and cage the Boers, the retreating Boers, against these blockhouse lines. However, the blockhouses couldn't be built out of stone and cement anymore, because they had to roll a lot of them out. So they started experimenting with corrugated iron and various shapes. And this one was built at Barberton, and this was built by the Barberton Town Guard. Again, it was built, designed by J.B. Winter, and it proved, like Barton's Folly, to be rather useless because, if you can see from this photograph, it could also be enfiladed from higher ground. And on the left-hand side out of the picture, there's even higher ground than this. So any Boer force who happened to approach the blockhouse could go into the neighboring koppies and fire through the roof and cause the garrison to surrender rather smartly. We mentioned earlier the Orange Grove blockhouse, and people know that, well, some people know that just outside Johannesburg, just to the north of Johannesburg, the suburb of Orange Grove, shortly after the fall of Johannesburg, Lord Roberts set up his headquarters at Orange Grove. And soon after that, this blockhouse was erected over the pass leading northwards towards Pretoria. And this was the Orange Grove blockhouse. So nothing to do with the one which is currently near Broederstroom, but people have heard of it, and they imagine that above Killarney, that sort of area, they knew that there was a blockhouse, and this is what it looked like. Here's a contemporary photograph. Here's an unusual blockhouse which has been erected on a wagon chassis, like a mobile blockhouse. Now, the famous war correspondent and even more famous Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was in South Africa at the time, and he was credited with the invention of the tank in the First World War. Now, I just wonder if he got his example or his idea of the tank from this early experiment in a mobile blockhouse from the Anglo-Boer War. So there was a Colonel Rice who was doing experiments in Vereeniging, and he stumbled upon the idea, based on a water tank, of erecting a blockhouse which was a parallel wall, if you like, of corrugated iron, which could be erected in the field by unskilled labor. Now, unskilled labor being ordinary soldiers rather than Royal Engineers. And this could be manufactured in sections and bolted together in the field. And after it had been bolted together, then shingles or small pebbles could be inserted between the two skins of the blockhouse. And this is a very good example of a rice pattern blockhouse. This is blockhouse number 66, which is above the farm Onze Rus, which was President Stein's farm in the Orange Free State. And this is a little bit closer. So even the loopholes were prefabricated and could be inserted and bolted together in this particular blockhouse. However, you can see there's a line of stones in front of the blockhouse. Now, the protection afforded by the shingles or the pebbles or the stones or the sand that was put in between the two skins proved to be a little bit inadequate, especially if the Boers had artillery. And sometimes they had moved artillery around or captured artillery, and they were able to shell these blockhouses. So the British very quickly learned that they'd better put some more adequate protection around the blockhouse. And here you can see in the form of a stone wall, so that any shells or bullets couldn't penetrate the blockhouse. Inside, it was very hot and confined, so this is an impression of what it's like inside a blockhouse. It can be manned by typically about 8 or 12 men, and they would usually camp outside, and at night they would occupy it in sections because it was obviously too hot or too cold during winter to occupy and sleep in during the night. There's another impression of inside the blockhouse. Now, in between the blockhouses, now the Boers, when they were hemmed in by the army and they were retreating against various blockhouse lines and the barbed wire fences, they still had Scotch cots and various transport, and they would create a distraction up the blockhouse line and then cross the various lines. And so the British had to counter this. So what they did is they dug trenches, and this is an example of a surviving trench between blockhouses to prevent the Boers crossing the blockhouse lines using their transport. So this is about 2 meters wide and 2 meters deep originally. It's a very good example. They were dug over many hundreds of kilometers parallel to the railway lines and to the blockhouses all through South Africa. And if you know where to look, driving down to Mpumalanga from Pretoria, you will see some of these remaining trenches between sort of parallel to the existing railway line. Here's a very good example of a rice-pattern blockhouse. This one was re-erected at the Museum of the Boer Republics in Bloemfontein, which is a very nice place to visit. And here you can actually go into one of these old blockhouses, which are 120 years old now. And here you can see protective masonry around the blockhouse. This particular rice-pattern blockhouse was built above the railway line at Daspoort, which is an important pass in Magaliesburg of the main railway line going north towards Petersburg. And this was a postcard issued shortly after the Anglo-Boer War, where you can see civilians visiting this blockhouse, which has been very carefully protected by a wall of masonry. So it's a lot of fun looking at blockhouses and things from very interesting angles. And this particular exploration was done by myself there and Major John Pennyfather in Swartruggens. And here we were exploring the British fortifications on Butters Kopje and Zoutjes Kopje, which were put up very hastily by the British during what was known as the Elands River Siege. And this year in August, on the 15th of August, we're actually commemorating that siege, where we are placing a blue plaque on Zoutjes Kopje in commemoration of the brave Australian and Rhodesian troops who held out against overwhelming Boer assailants over a period of nearly 2 weeks. So here we are preparing a cherry picker for our ascent into above the battlefield. This particular shot is taken of Major John Pennyfather by myself above the British headquarters, which later became the cemetery. And here you can see some of the British graves of the victims of that siege. So the British had their headquarters up here at Swartruggens above what is now the cemetery. And there you can see we're only halfway up, so it was quite terrifying up there. You can see some of the British fortifications, which they built rather quickly on Butters Kopje. And this is Martin Stolz and his son, a sky view from the cherry picker. And there, myself and John are doing our very extensive and interesting site recording of the various forts on Butters Kopje. And that's what it looked like from the top. This is the British mess and some trenches all along Butters Kopje. and the Boers were out here in the hills under General De La Rey, shelling the kopje, and Zouch's kopje is somewhere there in the distance, and the water supply is down here in the valley, which was key in that battle. And here, Martin has cleared the area since then, and here we have yours truly in one of the trenches, having some fun with friends and doing a bit of sight training. This is Lebongele, also known as Tough, and we were actually doing a bit of role playing in the trenches and having quite a good time. This is on top of Nooitgedacht, a very unusual Sanger, and these are my Australian friends, Grant and Leith, and they gave this particular Sanger a name and they called it the Blackadder Sanger, because it's faced totally in the wrong direction. The Boers were never going to attack from the south, they were going to attack from the north. The north is where we're looking from, down towards the south. And in fact, although it was built very, very beautifully and elegantly for a single person, right in front of it, there was an outcrop of rocks. So what on earth it was going to defend against, we don't know. So that's why it became known as the Blackadder Sanger. And then my friend Andre Veerpol, and fellow historian, at the same Blackadder Sanger, on a very rainy day on Nooitgedacht battlefield, just before the Blue Plock placing, a week before, where we were doing a recce on the summit of Nooitgedacht, and we managed to locate the Sanger in spite of the mist. And there, just to conclude, there's my friend Grant Mitchell. I don't know if this was a rainbow or some kind of blessing, but this is really a very, very interesting, complex fort on the summit of Nooitgedacht. And we were trying to figure it out, whether it was a gun position, whether it was later on used as stables by the British garrison, but certainly a really interesting place to explore.